Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Michael Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History in Washington, D.C. And what we do here is tell the stories of Jewish service in the American military going back to prior to the Revolutionary War up through the present. Today we focus on the Civil War and the Jewish soldiers that were POWs at Andersonville Prison. Jewish POWs are an endlessly fascinating topic, really through all the wars, going back to the Revolution, certainly through Vietnam. And actually, let me take the moment while I'm thinking of Vietnam to acknowledge Sheldon Goldberg, who is really doing tremendous writing and research on Jewish POWs in Vietnam right now. World War II is what gets most of the attention, where people, our museum visitors, often ask, what was it like to be a Jewish prisoner of the Nazis? And it's worth noting right now, we are next week, they will be posthumously awarding the Medal of Honor to Roddy Edmonds, a Christian soldier who refused to identify who was Jewish in Stalag 9A, was acknowledged by Yad Vashem several years ago and should be receiving the Medal of Honor posthumously next week. So a lot of work going on with POWs right now, and I was really thrilled when I got in touch with the folks from the Shapell Roster for Jewish Service in the Civil War and talked about doing a webinar, and they suggested doing this topic around Andersonville. I'm really excited to learn more. These will mostly be news stories to me, and it's always great to work with the research team from the Shapell Roster. They've really done amazing work researching, attempting to verify and document the Jews who served in the Civil War. And I can't speak highly enough of how great a resource the database is. It's the first place I turn whenever I'm starting to research as a Civil War soldier or need any kind of information about a Jewish Civil War soldier or sailor. It's been super helpful to me, and anyone interested in the Civil War really should be checking it out. So it's great to be here with Caitlin and Alex, along with Evan Kutzler. Evan is the perfect guy to give us a feel for what Andersonville Prison was really like. I'm probably only aware of it by reputation, pretty notorious reputation. But Evan is a historian and professor at Western Michigan University, and amongst his books is Living by Inches: The Smells, Sounds, Tastes, and Feeling of Captivity in Civil War Prisons. Caitlin Winkler is the senior researcher for the Roster Project. She joined the project in 2012. Alexandra Apito, also a senior researcher, and has been doing this since 2013. I've known them most of this time, and it's really been a pleasure to see the work and the database develop. We will get the Q&A after the presentation is over, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. The chat is there as well. I see some people already chatting. Feel free to use that throughout. But if you want your question answered, please do use the Q&A. We will get to that at the end, but you can go ahead and start submitting questions whenever you like. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Evan, Caitlin, and Alex.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to provide an overview of Civil War prisons and Andersonville. Prisoners were everywhere in the American Civil War. There were prisoners on battlefields, on steamboats, in boxcars. They were imprisoned in old converted training camps, in slave pens, old city jails, state penitentiaries, factories and warehouses, insane asylums, as well as formally planned prisons like Camp Sumter, or as it's more commonly called, Andersonville. One out of every 7 soldiers was a prisoner during the American Civil War. Andersonville grew to be the largest by population, and it came to have the worst reputation of all the Confederate prisons. It was located in southwest Georgia and built in the winter of 1863 and 64. Why southwest Georgia? It was far from the front lines of Virginia and North Georgia. It was along a rail line, despite being isolated. And there were abundant resources, food and timber. There was labor in the form of enslaved people that was impressed, forced into service by the Confederate government to build the network of fortifications and wooden stockades. Civil War prisons, like battlefields and hospitals, crushed American self-assurance that they lived on a cutting edge of modernity or civilization. This sense of decline or decivilization that took place during the Civil War took place very quickly. For someone like Samuel Gibson, a 30-year-old carpenter from Pennsylvania, it took 5 days for him to write in his diary that he had wished to be killed in battle rather than to have been captured. Aboard a train in what prisoners referred to as a cattle car, He wrote, "I would prefer to be killed than be captured and killed by inches and starved to death." What he called then slim living had already started to take its toll. The next day, he found himself envious of the memories of animals back home in Pennsylvania. He wrote, "I wish I was my father's dog." He arrived at Andersonville 6 days later. Now let's situate Andersonville in time. The red line here marks the approximate population of Confederate prisons. Kind of bear with me. Confederate prisons and Northern prisons between 1861 and 1865. If you roughly double this, you'll get the sense for the total number of prisoners in U.S. prisons and in Confederate prisons. We don't have great numbers for how many prisoners were in the Confederate prisons, so this is the closest estimate that I can offer. Prison history in the Civil War is best thought of as taking place in three distinct periods. From the beginning of the war through July 1862, prison populations rose. They gained a reputation as terrible places. Some have said that this is sort of an era where there's more humanity shown between prisoners. I don't see that. I don't see there being, a strict kind of declension of the conditions. It's bad throughout. It gets worse maybe, but it never starts well. So prisons were notorious in 1861 and 1862. Then from July 1862 to June 1863, there was a parole and exchange system that largely emptied U.S. and Confederate prisons. Then, for myriad reasons, especially the question over the Confederate policy not to exchange black prisoners of war, this agreement broke down in the summer of 1863. And this began a third and much more deadly phase of prison history. The populations, as you can see, of prisons rose very quickly in 1863, and they did not fall again until 1865. And this is the phase in which Andersonville was constructed, it was populated, and the entire history of Andersonville is in kind of the last 14 months of the war. The first U.S. prisoners arrived at Andersonville in late February 1864. Our best guess is February. Late February. Best guess is February 24th, 1864. The population rose until there were 33,000 prisoners there in that August. Then, when General Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864, the population plummeted as Confederates moved prisoners eastward to other prisons to keep them out of what they imagined were the possible next movement of Sherman's army at that time. So by the middle of September, you really only had the weakest prisoners who were still left in Andersonville. You see, the prison population was declining rapidly and continue to do so throughout the rest of the fall. Numbers are both kind of necessary, and also they can conceal as much as they reveal. It's fair to say that, yes, the 13,000 deaths took place over 14 months at Andersonville. It's also fair to say that 11,000 of those deaths took place in the 6 months between May 1st, 1864 and October 31st, 1864, when the prison population was over 10,000, when it was well over its kind of recommended usage of or space of 6,000 to 8,000 prisoners. So, and as proxies for experience, a chart like this can be a bit misleading. One kind of, I think, additional context that's helpful here is you don't see how this is changing relative to the kind of the average daily kind of population of the prison. So let's think of it another way. In May 1864, the death rate for the course of the month was about 4%, or about 1 in 25 prisoners died in May 1864. In August, which had the highest death rate by total numbers, about 1 in 11 prisoners perished. And then in October, so after the prison population has been partially evacuated, 1 in 4 prisoners died. So even though the number is going down here, the total prison population is falling much more quickly, and so the death rate was actually increasing as you go through September and October 1864. Now, the condition of arriving prisoners affected survivability. So this picture on the left is Belle Isle on the James River in Richmond, Virginia, where nearly all of the first prisoners who arrived at Andersonville had spent the winter before being sent to Andersonville in February, March, or April. On the right are prisoners who were so sick they were part of a special exchange of prisoners that spring. I know I just said that there were no exchanges. Well, there's exceptions to everything. And in the spring of 1864, some of these prisoners from Belle Isle are released as others were being sent down to Andersonville. And these photographs are turned into woodcuts, are published in newspapers like Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's weekly magazine, and they carry a story. It's This is the story of Belle Isle, and they'll become to be kind of intermixed with Andersonville. It's hard to see through Andersonville back to this earlier period, but this is seen as evidence that the Confederacy is intentionally starving U.S. prisoners in the South. But I bring in these photos in Belle Isle to make the point that hunger, chronic diarrhea, scurvy had already worn down the earliest prisoners by the time they arrived at Andersonville. So I'm going to show you this lithograph. It was published by a former prisoner, Thomas O'Day. It's one of several post-war bird's eye view maps of Andersonville. In the background, you can see a train and prisoners marching from the train towards the prison camp. You'll see the resources that are being used in the construction of the prison. Those are longleaf pines off in the distance. That's what the prison stockade would be created from, out of the pine forest of Southwest Georgia, through the labor, the knowledge and the skills of hundreds of enslaved black men to create there's multiple stockades, but the inner stockade is it's easy to remember, is almost exactly a mile, about 5,280 feet in perimeter. And just think about the labor that goes into felling, crafting, shaping, putting up each of those posts. That is all enslaved labor that was used by the Confederacy. You can see also O'Day has the valley clearly laid out, how the drainage it works at Andersonville, the stream that runs through it. He shows in detail. If you were to zoom in, you could see that that O'Day shows the prisoners at the upstream side getting drinking water out of the stream. In the middle, they're bathing, and then the sinks or the latrines are at the lower end. We get a sense of how the Confederate military was thinking about 19th century medical topography, or what was called sanitation, which meant ventilation and drainage, really at the time. This was present in the construction of Andersonville, always second to control. And one feature that is visible in this map is also what was called the deadline. This is a small rail fence that separated prisoners inside the stockade an extra 10 or 15 feet from the stockade wall itself. It's called the deadline. It's where we get our term, a deadline, today. It initially has this very visceral spatial reference to, if you cross this line, the guards will shoot you, to this kind of more abstract time limit by the end of the 19th century. But prisoners could be shot for crossing or even touching the deadline. Prisoners came to interpret the sounds of gunshots at Andersonville during the day and especially at night as evidence that the Confederate guards were shooting down their own soldiers. The same prisoners came to interpret the sounds of dogs day or night as evidence that prison escapees were being hunted down by bloodhounds. Now, this is all part of a deadly tug of control and resistance that ranged from simple but potentially deadly acts of resistance, like talking back in the middle of the night, to stealing, to prison escapes. Prisoners wrote about these things after the war, I believe, to counter assertions that were and prejudices that were common, prevalent in the North, that the prisoners who had ended up at Andersonville, sure, they may be victims, but they're also bad soldiers. And ex-prisoners after the Civil War wanted the country to know that their soldiering had continued after capture. It did not end as prisoners, but continued throughout. And this urge to write down experiences, or to take years drawing this bird's eye view map, I think is also part of a debate about who was responsible for the suffering. Now, don't mistake me. U.S. soldiers knew that the Confederates had a strong role in their treatment. Prisoners also believed that there was blame to go around. Samuel Gibson, who I mentioned at the beginning, he feared being killed by inches. That's where I got the title of my book. He blamed the Lincoln administration for not agreeing to Confederate requests to exchange white prisoners and white prisoners alone. So on June 16th, he wrote, I love my country and my government, and I believe I am as loyal as a man can be, but I will put upon record that I do not like the policy of the present administration. I do not like an administration that will not protect its citizen soldiers when unfortunately prisoners of war. The everlasting, and he writes the N word, must be protected, and the soldier may take care of himself. This seems to be the policy pursued. This is a common sentiment at Andersonville. Now, this photograph was taken by Andrew Jackson Riddle. It shows Andersonville from the guard post next to the North Gate. This is about as close as we're ever going to get to seeing what prisoners saw as they were arriving. But this is not a photograph of prisoners arriving. Riddle was photographing the arrival of rations, and if you squint and look very closely at this, you might be able to see a wheel from a wagon. I can promise you that there's a mule in there as well. This is the process of distributing rations to representatives from different detachments of the prisoners elsewhere. They're going to take the food, they're going to take it back to their detachments, they're going to further subdivide it into what are called messes of prisoners. Prison food varied. It included soup, rice, beans. It often came down to what later was called the three M's of the Southern diet: meal, which meant cornmeal; meat, almost always pork; and sometimes molasses, usually sorghum molasses. The food was often inedible. This reality helps explain why hungry prisoners, they traded away food. They gambled it away. They spent much of their time manipulating it into something that was palatable or familiar. The closest prisoners could come to making something like coffee was to take that cornbread, perhaps inedible cornbread, to burn it, to stir it into hot water and make what they called crust coffee or conscript coffee. Frederick Augustus James recorded a little poem about Andersonville and about food and about coffee, while also commenting back, I think, on this public discourse about prisoners as poor soldiers. So there's a tongue-in-cheek warning in here to always do your best. And I think this is a good example of prisoner humor at Andersonville. It goes something like this, and keep in mind I'm a history professor, not an English professor. Now, volunteers and substitutes, whilst marching in the column, it behooves each and all of you to take this warning solemn. Don't leave your ranks on any account or circumstance whatever, or else you'll see that nabbed you'll be unless you're very clever. The host of Union prisoners that swell the number taken are captured by the roadside at their coffee and their bacon. This fact should be well borne in mind by all good Union thinkers, that 2 out of 3 that captured be are straggling coffee drinkers. The prison fare is served out here as scanty, poor, and bad. A mite of pork, of meal 1 pint is all that can be had. Of coffee you'll not get 1 sup in this pine log institution, but foul air and water quite enough to wreck your constitution. Now, James had not been captured by the roadside frying bacon or drinking coffee. He knew it. He was a sailor. He was captured as part of a ill-fated amphibious landing on Fort Sumter in September 1863. He did the circuit, the pre-Andersonville circuit. He arrived sick, as did many others. People like James, I think, found humor in the painful circumstances of prison life. Now, we're going to move around the prison to the other side from the gate. Riddle took 2 photographs with the sinks of the latrines here in the foreground. I could spend a lot of time on this photograph. I have lots of theories about this. But for today, for now, what I want you to see is that space at Andersonville was not created equal. Confederate physicians estimated that prisoners in August 1864 had between 35 and 38 square feet per person. What that means is that someone who's a little bit taller than me, maybe 6 foot, if you stand out and you put your arms at length, you can if everyone is spread out like atoms, it would be just enough space for everyone in that in that prison. But everyone was not spread out like atoms, and that's what this photograph shows. Confederates knew this. The guards knew this. When they testified at the Wirtz trial, they talked about preferring sentry duty a mile or 2 miles away from Andersonville because that's the distance that they measured the odor of Andersonville. And I believe you can also see how prisoners are responding to the environmental catastrophe and the human crime of Andersonville around the unsanitary conditions in how they are moving away from the stream. There's uninhabitable space. You can see just a fragment of that dead line that's crossing the stream. You can also see how the tents are primarily congregated up at the top of that hill. Moving over into the this next photo is a burial trench at Andersonville taken the next day, again mid August 1864. This was, I forget the exact grave number, but this is about the 5,000th or the 6,000th prisoner to die at Andersonville, buried in long burial trenches. The people you're seeing doing the burying in this photograph are also prisoners. They're paroled prisoners who've taken an oath not to flee. In exchange, they work outside the prison. They receive extra rations. And this was controversial. Many prisoners who refused to work on the outside thought that this was a form of aid to the enemy, refused parole on any grounds. The graves at Andersonville, from grave number one, who was buried, tomorrow's the anniversary, February 27th, 1864, to the about 13,000th prisoner in the spring of 1865. They tell a chronological story of death. They started as burial number one. They ended at burial number almost 13,000. And the after the war, this sort of crude prison cemetery becomes a national cemetery. It gets kind of wrapped up in the history of Reconstruction. After the war, hundreds of freed people turned a rough prison burial ground where only numbers are identifying the dead to a national cemetery. There's earth brought in to raise the level of the soil. Streets are put out, trees are planted, there's walks. There's a wall built entirely around the cemetery, and then for generations, African Americans in Southwest Georgia used the prisons or the cemetery space as well as the prison space, I believe, as a space to not only celebrate emancipation, but also to commemorate the sacrifice, the military sacrifice that took place there, and this sort of celebration way in the Deep South becomes part of the initial steps towards the preservation of the site. I mean, it's unclear in 1865 whether or not the prison site and including the National Cemetery is going to go back to the original landowner who leased it to the Confederate government. This is a lawsuit that takes place in the 1860s and 70s. But the preservation is partially the government, it's partially private. George Washington Kennedy, an African American farmer, purchased the prison site adjacent to the cemetery, and then sold off the prison site to the Grand Army of the Republic for preservation in the 1890s, 8 decades before the prison site would be kind of joined with the cemetery as Andersonville National Historic Site in 1970. So thank you for the time. I'll turn it over to the co-presenters, and I'll look forward to taking some questions later. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Mike Rugel and to the museum for welcoming us back, and to Dr. Kutzler for providing the broader context for these Jewish soldiers' experiences at Andersonville. The stories we will be sharing today were uncovered from a collaborative effort with the museum focused on identifying members of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, and we hope to offer a more personal lens into the trials undergone by men in prison there. Before we discuss Jewish soldiers at Andersonville, we would like to tell you a little bit about the Shapell Roster more broadly. The Shapell Roster is an ongoing reappraisal of the military service of Jews in the American Civil War, presented as an online database containing more than 50 searchable data fields, a bibliography of more than 2,500 primary and secondary sources, and more than 50,000 historical documents. In August of 2022, the Union records were made available to the public with a plan to release Confederate records state by state. In 2024, we published the records from Kentucky, this past year, Louisiana, and our goal is to publish Georgia this year. A brief overview of how we got here begins 14 years ago when Benjamin Shapell wanted to create a more user-friendly and historically accurate version of Simon Wolfe's The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. This book was written in 1895 in response to allegation that Jews were not willing to fight for their country. It was an impressive undertaking for its time, but known to be incomplete, and in many instances based on name profiling. We began to review Wolfe's roster and realized how much more the Shapell roster could include given the breadth of information now available. While we may never know an exact number as of today, there are 3,295 records in the Shapell roster with evidence of Judaism and proof of service. 1,762 of them have Union service and 1,533 with Confederate service, and this also includes 8 soldiers that served on both sides. And we're discovering new soldiers all the time. Determining where a Union POW was held in Confederate custody is a surprisingly difficult task, as many of the Confederate prison records did not survive the war. Most federal records for Union POWs identify when a service member was captured and when they were paroled. Many include no accounting for where the soldier was in between those two dates. Incomplete databases exist, built from different sources, trying to recreate the POW rolls from Andersonville. They are monumental undertakings and very useful, but by no means comprehensive or complete. The best source we have for learning where a Union soldier was imprisoned is the pensions. These include soldiers' own accountings of their time in the service, corroborated by their comrades. This is not a problem for Confederate POWs, as their prison rolls were federal records and remained in the custody of the U.S. government. In fact, these prison rolls are often the only way we can identify men as Confederate soldiers. So far, we have identified 403 Jewish soldiers and sailors who were captured during the Civil War at some point. Less than half of these soldiers served for the Union. 167 Jewish Union service members have become prisoners of war during the conflict. Of the 167 Union POWs, we have discovered 25 soldiers were confined at Andersonville Prison at some point during their time in Confederate custody. Of the 25, only 4 were born in the United States, and the rest were born somewhere in Europe. This pie chart shows which states Jewish POWs at Andersonville served from. 11 soldiers, almost 50%, served in New York regiments, 3 served in Massachusetts regiments, and the rest of the states shown here had only 1 or 2 POWs at Andersonville. 16 of the men were captured during battles fought in Virginia, including 3 at the Battle of Bristow Station and 3 at Spotsylvania Courthouse. 4 of the men were captured in Georgia, including 2 at the Battle of Peachtree Creek. 2 men were captured in Pennsylvania, both at Gettysburg. 2 were captured in Florida, both at the Battle of Olustee, and 1 was captured in Tennessee in a skirmish in Shelby County. Research is ongoing, and we identify new Jewish Civil War soldiers all the time, and also uncover more about previously identified soldiers' service, so all of these numbers are subject to change. Of the 25 identified Jewish POWs who ended up at Andersonville Prison, 4 never made it out. Sergeant Julius Baywood of the 1st New York Cavalry, Sergeant Meyer Newberger of the 7th Indiana Cavalry, and Private Morris Silberstein of the 4th New York Heavy Artillery all died at Andersonville in September 1864 during the period when the prison had its highest death rate. This photograph of the cemetery was taken in August 1864, a month before these Jewish soldiers would join its ranks. Sergeant Elias Leon Heineman of the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry died later in February of 1865. Some of these men had definitive causes of death given, including pneumonia and scurvy. Others' deaths were credited broadly to, quote, rebel cruelty, as seen here in Julius Baywood's carded service record held by the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Julius Baywood, often misidentified as Boywood, including on his grave marker, Meyer Newberger, and Elias Leon Heineman were all interred in Andersonville Cemetery and still have markers there today. These individual tombstone photos were taken in recent times. There is no record of where Morris Silberstein was buried. It is likely he too was buried at the prison, but unlike at other Civil War cemeteries, it is uncommon for someone to be buried at Andersonville without documentation. Elias Leon Heinemann was the only one of the four whose remains were later reinterred by his family. His mother and uncle traveled to Georgia a year after the war ended and 15 months after his death to return Heinemann's body home to Philadelphia, where he was reinterred at the Mikveh Israel Cemetery. The Shapell roster tracks where Jewish soldiers were buried, and so far we have found for the Union side that 25% of those who died during the war, either in battle, from their wounds, or from disease, ultimately received a Jewish burial, a surprisingly high number given the effort it took for a family to retrieve their loved one's remains. While the other 21 Jewish POWs managed to leave Andersonville, their imprisonment there was not without serious consequences. The majority of these men were reported to have developed scurvy there, and many suffered from long-term debility and other medical conditions due to the hardships that they endured. The story of Adolf Kohn and Louis Zellner, along with some of their Jewish comrades, is what inspired this program today. Adolf Kohn of the 13th Massachusetts Infantry is one of the more recently identified Hebrew Union Veterans Association members, and while reviewing his military records to confirm his HUVA membership, we uncovered an additional account of Jewish fellowship that we were not expecting. Louis Zellner of the 47th New York Infantry provided Kohn with a sworn statement shortly after the end of the war, supporting his claim for back pay. Zellner was a new name to us, so we requested his pension to determine if he was also Jewish, and not only confirmed that, but found a trove of fantastic affidavits, which together tell one of the strongest tales of Jewish camaraderie during the Civil War that we have discovered. At the center, here on your screen, we have an excerpt from a statement made by Adolf Kohn supporting Louis Zellner's claim for a pension, explaining to the pension examiner why he could speak with authority on Zellner's condition at Andersonville. Kohn stated, quote, "I first met Zellner in Andersonville Prison early in 1864. While in Andersonville, after he came there, I met him nearly, if not quite, every day. There were but a few Hebrews, Zellner, Morris Spitzer, a man named Weichelbaum, I remember, and we naturally became friends together. There were a few others, but I do not remember their names." The pair remained together at Andersonville, supporting one another until Kohn was transferred to the hospital. After the war, they reunited in New York City and would remain friends for the rest of their lives, with Kohn submitting at least 4 different affidavits and depositions during Zellner's fight to receive a pension. Morris Spitzer, who Kohn mentioned, was a private in the 54th New York Infantry. He was captured at Gettysburg in July 1863 and imprisoned with Kohn first at Belle Isle Prison in Richmond before they were sent south to Andersonville. He also provided testimony for Zellner's pension as well as for Kohn's, and Zellner repaid the favor with an affidavit for Spitzer's pension. The, quote, "man named Weichelbaum" was Bernard Weichelbaum, a private who served with Zellner in the 47th New York Infantry. Weichelbaum and Zellner were captured together during the Battle of Olustee in Florida in February 1864. All 4 men ended up in New York City after the war for a significant period, and Weichelbaum joined the Hebrew Union Veterans Association like Kohn, perhaps seeking similar fraternity to what he had found with this group at Andersonville. In total, 7 of the Jews imprisoned at Andersonville would join the HUVA. Adolf Kohn, a native of Berlin, immigrated to the United States after the Civil War began in 1862. A year later, he enlisted as a private in the 13th Massachusetts Infantry under an alias. We have a lot of Union soldiers who enlisted under aliases, and you'll hear about more of them today. But Kohn had a particularly unique reason for using one. He explained he gave the name Simon or Samuel Wood when volunteering because he was hiding from a former business partner after getting, quote, "too intimate with the partner's wife." He was captured at Bristow Station less than 3 months after enlisting in October 1863, and allegedly 6 days after he deserted from his regiment. It is unknown whether Kohn was marked as a deserter in error and was fighting alongside his regiment at Bristow Station, or if he picked the wrong place to straggle after trying to leave. Outside of the group of Jewish comrades we mentioned, Kohn was also captured with fellow HUVA member Private Gustav Newman of the 18th Massachusetts Infantry at the Battle of Bristoe Station. Cohn was in Confederate custody for over a year and spent the majority of that time at Andersonville. Towards the end of his incarceration in September 1864, Cohn was sent to Savannah to work in the Confederate Iron Works and was fortunate to make a very resourceful friend. According to Cohn, quote, "While a prisoner, I made the acquaintance of a Negro of the name of Pollock who lived in Savannah. In the month of December 1864, he furnished me with a Confederate jacket and cap and helped me to make my escape out of the stockade. And then he kept me in his house until General Sherman came into Savannah, Georgia on the 25th day of December, 1864. I reported myself at General Sherman's headquarters, and on the first day of January, 1865, I was sent by order of General Sherman to New York City." Once in New York City, while trying to recoup his back pay, Cohn took the advice of a questionable bounty broker and ended up enlisting again in the 1st New Jersey Cavalry without a formal discharge from the 13th Massachusetts. This time, he used the alias James Warren or Warner, per the bounty broker's instructions, to avoid detection as a deserter. Cohn did receive an honorable discharge from the 1st New Jersey Cavalry, and after an arduous fight with the federal government, did eventually receive a pension for his efforts during the Civil War. After the war, Cohn settled in New York City, surrounded by his Jewish comrades, and worked as a clothing merchant. During his time at Andersonville, Cohn was sent to the hospital and treated for scurvy. But in spite of this, he lived a long life, not dying until 1930 at the ripe old age of 92. Louis Zellner was born in Prussia and immigrated to New York City as a toddler. He volunteered as a private in the Les Enfants Perdus, New York Infantry, a regiment that used a French term as its title, directly translating to the lost children, a phrase used to describe soldiers on a dangerous mission. In spite of the French name, the regiment was also known as the German Legion, based on the nationality of the majority of its members. Zellner served for a time as a nurse in the regimental hospital and then transferred to the 47th New York Infantry when Les Enfants Perdus was disbanded. After his capture at Olustee, Zellner remained in Confederate custody for over 14 months until the end of the Civil War. He spent most of his time as a POW at Andersonville, but was ultimately paroled in Jacksonville, Florida, long after his group of friends we have been discussing. Fortunately for Zellner, he was not alone during this time. Like Cohn, Zellner had an additional Jewish comrade to lean on as a prisoner outside of this group of four. Private Samuel Greenthal, who also served under the alias Gustav Schroeder in the 15th New York Heavy Artillery, was captured later than the rest of these soldiers while on picket duty in Caroline County, Virginia, in May 1864. He remained in captivity at Andersonville Prison until spring 1865 with Louis Zellner. Greenthal was recorded as a deserter when he failed to return to his regiment after his parole. Zellner testified on Greenthal's behalf when he was later seeking an honorable discharge. According to an affidavit by Zellner, where he referred to Greenthal by his alias, the pair were, quote, previous acquaintances before they were reunited at Andersonville Prison, at which time Schroeder became his immediate companion, and they slept together from the time said Schroeder was so admitted until the collapse of the rebellion. After his release, Zellner returned to New York City. In 1874, he married Aurelia Murray, the daughter of an 1812 veteran from Vermont. Aurelia was not born Jewish, but the pair were married by a rabbi at Zellner's parents' home, so she likely converted for Zellner. After their marriage, Zellner and Aurelia moved to Vermont near her family and remained there for the rest of their lives. Thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin to discuss our next soldiers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today again. In spite of a 6-year age gap, Gottlieb Spitzer and Sidney Sigmund Herzberg formed a bond that endured for many years and helped them both survive their time at Andersonville Prison. The pair met each other before the service, either in Baltimore or New York, and according to Herzberg, quote, "We became intimate friends. We both endeavored to get a situation for a while, but failed doing so. Our resources then becoming rapidly exhausted, we concluded to enter the service and put our bounty in the bank until our time should have expired." We both had family connections in New York, and we concluded to enlist outside of New York and under assumed names. Spitzer and Herzberg accordingly traveled to Connecticut at the end of September 1863 and volunteered as privates in the 14th Connecticut Infantry. Spitzer, then 23, used the alias Gottfried Brunner, quote, in case he was killed in the army, so his people would not know about it, which was especially important to him since Spitzer's father had paid for him to avoid conscription in the Austrian army. Herzberg was only 17 and had already adopted the Americanized Sidney amongst friends, so he used the alias Sidney Smith. He would later lay out 3 different reasons he used this alias. The first, of course, being that he was a minor. The second, he had previously attempted to enlist using his correct name and age and was rejected on account of youth, so he thought he might be flagged. And finally, the third reason was that from, quote, from 1860 up to May 1863, said Sidney Herzberg was a resident of Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia, from whence he ran the blockade, entering the Union lines near Green Spring Run, Virginia, from whence he was sent by the provost marshal to Cumberland and Baltimore. So Herzberg did not want to be identified as a traitor to the Confederacy if captured. Gottlieb Spitzer was captured only 2 weeks after the pair enlisted at the Battle of Bristoe Station, the same battle Adolph Kohn was taken during. 7 months later, in May 1864, Sidney Herzberg was captured at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. After becoming a prisoner, Herzberg explained he was, quote, taken to Andersonville, Georgia, and after being there about 2 to 3 weeks, I met Spitzer again. We then remained together, messed together, slept together until September 7th, when the first prisoners were removed. Spitzer was one of the first to leave, and I did not know where the rebels took him. 10 days later, my detachment's turn came, and we were sent to Charleston until its surrender. I next met with Spitzer. I had lost all trace of him at Washington at the trial of Captain Wirz, where I, waiting there to be called as a witness, heard his name, Gottlieb Brunner, called to the stand. After this, we both resumed our own names, and I shall regret it to the last days of my life that I have ever changed it after gaining the honor of having been a soldier in the Army of the United States. Captain Henry Wirz, the commandant of Andersonville Prison, was tried for war crimes in August 1865 in Washington, D.C., and ultimately found guilty and executed. Gottlieb Spitzer and Sidney Herzberg were 2 of the 158 witnesses heard from at the trial. Herzberg provided a general accounting of his time at Andersonville and the details of some of the abuses he witnessed there, but admitted to having no direct contact with Captain Wirz. Spitzer did have firsthand experience interacting with Wirz. He testified that, quote, one morning I was not able to stand up. Captain Wirz came into my tent. I do not like to state the language he used. He pulled out his revolver at me and said, get up, you Yankee son of a bitch, or I will kill you right on the spot. I said I would be better off if he would kill me. He took me by the hand, threw me out of the tent, kicked me on the back, and made me go to the roll call. I was sick at the time. It had been almost a year since Spitzer and Herzberg had seen each other when they were reunited at Wirz's trial. They would remain in contact for the rest of their lives and would help each other confirm their identities when applying for pensions, since they both enlisted under aliases. Spitzer, a native of Vienna, remained in the D.C. area after the trial, living in different places around Washington and Maryland. He lost his eyesight over time, an occurrence blamed on his sickness at Andersonville. His occupation was given on the 1900 census as capitalist, and he was a member of Washington Hebrew congregation, alongside one Simon Wolf. Wolf sent a letter on Spitzer's behalf to the Assistant Secretary of the Interior when Spitzer's pension benefits were reduced. He stated he was not involved in the veteran's claim in his capacity as an attorney, but explaining, quote, it is simply that, a feeling of sympathy and humanity, And I do trust that although you are overburdened with work, you will take the time and investigate and review this case, as it is one of the very few cases of a Jewish soldier who is on your list as a pensioner. This letter was written in 1891. Curiously, when Simon Wolf published his The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen 4 years later, he forgot Spitzer in his accounting of American Jewish service members. Sidney Sigmund Herzberg was not discharged from the service until 2 weeks before the trial of Henry Wurz. Notes in his service record claim he escaped Confederate custody to come north at the end of the war, but Herzberg denied that and said he was paroled at Charleston. He did mention that he was part of an escape attempt from Andersonville, but he and his fellow prisoners' plan was foiled by a rainstorm that collapsed the tunnels they were digging for their getaway. Before his discharge, Herzberg was transferred to the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery because the 14th Connecticut Infantry had already been mustered out of service. After his discharge, Herzberg traveled around out west, living in Colorado and Utah before settling in St. Louis, Missouri. He was an agent of the New York Life Insurance Agency for many decades, working into his 90s. As one of the last surviving Civil War veterans, Herzberg's comings and goings were often reported in the local paper. At age 93, he attended the Gettysburg Reunion of 1938, the last reunion of Civil War veterans held, which took place on the 75th anniversary of the famous battle. Herzberg was alleged to have been, quote, the only man there who didn't take along the companion allowed by the government, stating, "What do I need with a companion?" In 1938, Herzberg also attended the Jewish War Veterans of America's National Encampment. And as, quote, one of 2 Jewish survivors left from the Civil War, he held a place of honor in the parade. Here he is saluting during the parade in the picture at left, with Indian Wars veteran Adolph Hartman to his right. Sidney Herzberg died at age 95 in 1941, the second to last living Jewish Civil War veteran that we have identified so far. The last Jewish Civil War veteran alive was Daniel Harris, a landsman in the U.S. Navy and another Hebrew Union Veterans Association member, who the JWV appointed as its honorary commander. Levi Lazarus and Benno Lowenthal became acquaintances serving in different New York regiments during the Civil War. How closely they knew each other before their time at Andersonville, we don't know, but once they were there, their bond was cemented. Benno Lowenthal testified for Levi Lazarus's pension claim that he reunited with Lazarus 10 or 12 days after he arrived at Andersonville Prison. Lazarus was not in good shape. Lowenthal described the fits he would have, saying in June or July 1864, he, quote, saw Lazarus laying down and sprinkled water on him. Lowenthal did not describe what effect the water had on Lazarus, but his anecdote shows how these Jewish POWs tried to provide what aid they could to one another. Lowenthal went on to state to the pension examiner that he saw Lazarus often at Andersonville. The soldiers were paroled together in December 1864 at Charleston, South Carolina. We do not know what kind of relationship the pair maintained after their parole, but when Lazarus needed Lowenthal's assistance, over 20 years later, Lowenthal answered the call. Levi Lazarus was born in Amsterdam and immigrated to the United States at age 13. Born Levi Artipel, the soldier was adopted by his uncle Abraham Lazarus, who encouraged him to change his name. According to the soldier, quote, the name Artipel is the Dutch translation for potato, and my uncle, fearing that my Dutch name would occasion a good deal of ridicule on the part of those who knew me, changed it to Lazarus, which name I have, since that time, and up to the present day, been known by. In August 1862, the now named Levi Lazarus volunteered in the 125th New York Infantry as a private. One of his commanding officers identified him later as the only Hebrew in the regiment, which so far has proved to be true. He was captured at the Battle of Mine Run in Virginia in December 1863 and sent to Andersonville in February 1864 when the prison was opened. By the time he was paroled, Lazarus had spent a year in Confederate custody. His condition was so bad upon his return that after he received 30 days leave as a paroled POW, he spent 3 months in the hospital. By the time Lazarus returned to duty with his regiment, the war had ended. Lazarus was discharged from the service in June 1865 and became a U.S. citizen 5 months later. He remained in New York City for the rest of his life, working first as a tinsmith and later as an employee of the New York City Parks Department. He is one of the over 50 Union soldiers that we have discovered ketubot for in their pension files, and he was also a member of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association. Benno Lowenthal was one of 3 Prussian brothers who served for the Union during the Civil War. His older brother, Philip, was the first to answer the call, joining one of the 3-month militias from New York raised immediately following Fort Sumter and the declaration of war. His younger brother, Henry, joined the service only a few days after Philip, choosing to join the 7th New York Infantry, a 2-year regiment. And Benno joined less than a month after Henry, volunteering for 3 years' service in the 39th New York Infantry. Not only Philip's example, but also his insistence appears to have motivated his brothers to enlist. Philip wrote a letter to Major General John Wool requesting a furlough for Henry and stating that he enlisted in the service first and, quote, wrote to his 2 brothers that brothers of his they could no longer be if they too did not join the army of the Union. Benno chose the 39th New York Infantry, also called the Garibaldi Guard, a regiment known for distinct uniforms, and its colorful colonel, one Frederick George Deotassi, pictured here, who was confirmed as Jewish for the first time by the Shapell Roster. The Garibaldi Guard was formed of immigrants from different European countries, including Prussia, Hungary, Italy, Switzerland, France, and Spain, and it organized its men under officers that could speak their native languages. As seen in the recruiting poster here, the regiment appealed to recruits in their native tongues to boost their numbers. Benno started as a private and was technically captured for the first time when his regiment and many others surrendered to General Stonewall Jackson at the Battle of Harper's Ferry in September 1862. They were paroled the same day because Jackson was in a rush to rejoin Robert E. Lee for what would become the Battle of Antietam. Benno was promoted to corporal in the summer of 1863 and then wounded in the right shoulder at Bristow Station, the same battle where Adolf Kohn and Gottlieb Spitzer were captured. Benno was not captured again until May 1864 at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, where Sidney Herzberg was also taken. While at Andersonville, Benno suffered from scurvy, and his poor condition led to his earlier release than many of the men he was captured with. He ultimately remained in Confederate custody for 7 months, still a long time to have such a harrowing experience, but significantly shorter than the imprisonment of the rest of the soldiers we have discussed today. Benno Lowenthal also settled back in New York City after his discharge. He worked for years as a night watchman, citing his wound and his sufferings as a POW as the reasons he was not physically capable of completing more skilled labor for his occupation. His brother Philip joined the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, but we have not yet found evidence that Benno did. Of the 3 Lowenthal brothers, Benno lived the longest until 1923 when he passed at the Home for the Incurables, where he had been a resident for several years. So thanks everyone for joining us here today, and especially thank you again to Mike Rugel and the museum for having us, and Dr. Kutzler for joining our program. If you want to know more about the Shapell roster or Dr. Kutzler's work, Mike emailed out a PDF to everyone registered with links to our website as well as Dr. Kutzler's book, and you can read more about the soldiers we discussed today, as well as other Jewish POWs who are at Andersonville. If you think we are missing someone from the roster or you have additional information about a soldier already in there you would like to share, please email us at roster@shapell.org. And now, questions.
Yeah, if people want to submit questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Caitlin, I guess I'll go ahead and get it started with, with Lowenthal serving in the Garibaldi Garden. I guess we can extend this beyond just him. Did any of these guys comment on what they thought of Deotassi? Is there anything in the records on what other Jewish soldiers thought of this wild character?
I don't think we have a lot of testimony from the Jewish soldiers themselves. We have a lot of affidavits and testimony from people who were not Jewish, who did not like Deotassi. He was a very polarizing figure, but we have, I think the 39th is like maybe our third or fourth largest regiment with Jewish soldiers for New York. So a lot of them were inspired to join that regiment. And whether it was specifically Deotassi or the fact that they had these specific companies for different nationalities and they had officers that could speak their languages, it's unclear which one was the motivator, but
Yeah, the other thing that jumped out at me going out, there's so many of these guys from the Battle of Bristow Station. Was that a feeder battle for Andersonville, Evan, or was that just a coincidence?
Well, yes, they're both a coincidence and it's a feeder battle.
Hmm.
I think it is probably how this goes. You'll see that there a lusty is a common one. The battles around the wilderness. It's about timing, and so if there's and they I couldn't hear, were these in the same regiment? If that's the case, then I mean that also helps explain is that if they're clustered in a regiment, they're also likely
yeah.
to be clustered at the same point in.
So most of them were not in the same regiments. The only two that were captured together that were in the same regiment were the two captured at Olustee, Zellner and the other Spitzer. Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, a few questions coming in on the Q&A. Catherine Ladnier asks, can you comment on the Sultana disaster and which POWs from Andersonville died?
I do know that we have at least one, I want to say two Jewish soldiers who died in the
On the
Sultana
Sultana.
explosion. I don't remember their names off the top of my head. If you would like to email me, I would love to let you know who that is. So please email us at roster@shapell.org and I can look up that information if you want a specific name for it. But yeah, I think we have two soldiers that died in that accident.
Evan can obviously speak better than us to like the broader Sultana.
Yeah.
A couple questions we can pair this. An anonymous question: were the Jewish soldiers prisoners treated any differently? And Hal Hennig asked, was Confederate Commandant Captain Ward's anti-Semitic? So had a cruel reputation in general. Any specifics on anti-Semitism that anyone's come across?
We have not seen evidence that the treatment of the Jewish soldiers was any different than the soldiers at large. But as Dr. Kutzler was describing, it was all pretty bad. And Captain Wers, I don't know that we know anything about him being anti-Semitic. There were rumors of him being Jewish, kind of around the time of his trial and after the fact, which did seem quite anti-Semitic. And we did research and confirm he was not, in fact, Jewish, just because those rumors were out there, and he was not Jewish. But yeah, we have not seen specific evidence of anti-Semitism. That's not to say it wasn't there. But
The fault line was white and black in captivity for Civil War prisons. So, the shorthand is that black prisoners of war were essentially enslaved if they were physically capable of working at Andersonville. And sometimes they're enslaved locally, and sometimes they're sent elsewhere. But that's kind of the opposite of those paroled prisoners you saw working at the cemetery. There's another segregated group of black prisoners who don't get the option of working at Andersonville. They're forced into service. But I likewise didn't see any kind of direct evidence of a kind of a differentiated Jewish experience. But this is also part of like the relative numbers and what records survive as well.
So a couple questions specific to the Jewish experience in Andersonville. Did any prisoners later write about their inability to comply with dietary restrictions at Andersonville? And were Jewish chaplains ever available to serve the prisoners? I assume there's going to be nothing to serve in that type of role.
yeah, so I think we have 5 Jewish chaplains total who served during the Civil War, and none of them were at Andersonville. Most of them were around the hospitals, like in Tennessee, and I believe in Kentucky, kind of in the areas where there were a lot of Union hospitals where people were recovering, because there wasn't one Jewish regiment to send them out with. In terms of dietary practices, this is actually a question that comes up a lot and just in general with service. And it seems mostly along the lines that you're in survival mode and you're going to eat what you can get. We haven't seen like people actively complaining that they couldn't keep kosher or, they're feeding me pork. This is a problem. In fact, we have one story of a Union Jewish soldier who stole pork and got court-martialed for it. So you're going to eat what you can get when you're starving.
Yeah, go ahead,
There's
Evan.
yeah, sorry. There's very little. I mean, like religion is kind of more broadly is very important for prisoners. You see this in among what I would assume to be our Christian soldiers who talk about religion often in the days of the week, sending blending in together that like the rhythms of the week that have deep spiritual or religious meaning are not present in prison. So there's the no ringing of bells, for instance, and the in terms of I mean the only like religious exterior kind of intersection is there's a Catholic priest who comes in the fall of 1864, Father Whelan. But so anyway, just that a little bit of extra context there.
And did he report on the conditions at Andersonville, or the priest?
He reports on the conditions. He's I mean he administers last rites to a lot of prisoners there. Yeah. Yeah. From Savannah.
Gary Lehman asked, did any of these soldiers observe any holidays, festivals, or Shabbat? Actually, maybe you can answer that more generally outside of the POW experiences on Jews' ability to observe holidays while serving in the Civil War.
Yeah, so we do have a number of soldiers. We don't have a lot of evidence of them doing that on their own, like out in the woods while they are on the march fighting. But we do have a number of instances of soldiers on both sides of the war requesting furloughs, requesting a day off to go in if they're near a town that would have a synagogue to go and observe the Sabbath, especially around like Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, like holidays where there would be high services. If they had the ability to get to a Jewish congregation, we see soldiers asking to get leave to be able to go do that. We also see, again, if you're when troops were located near towns like Nashville, places like that, they're stationed outside big urban areas, them finding local Jewish families to sit with for Shabbat, for different, prayer services, things like that.
Gonna say I just actually we don't see it very often, I would say, but I was actually just looking at a Confederate soldier from Georgia yesterday who wrote to his brother saying that he was thinking of going into town while he was in, wherever he was for Yom Kippur. So we do see it. I don't think it's not super common, but it does exist for sure.
Ed Marshall asks, as a Navy veteran, do we have a count of Jewish sailor POWs? And maybe, Evan, you can address if folks from the Navy were ending up in these POW camps.
There certainly are plenty of members of the Navy. I can't speak to whether they were Jewish or not, but Frederick Augustus James, whose poem I read, he was a Navy POW.
We do have a number of Jewish Navy members from the Civil War. I think a few of them were POWs. None of them ended up at Andersonville, though. If you email us, I'm happy to give you more specific information. But I can't pull that up off the top of my head right now.
Okay, yeah, and we can send out a follow-up email with contact information and some links to everyone who registered today. And it looks like we're just about at the end. So I guess I will just thank you guys for being a part of this. Thank everybody for being on today. And do you guys have any last message you want to send out before we sign off?
Just thank you so much for coming, and we'd love to hear from anyone about anything. So please email us at roster@shapell.org. It's on the handout that was emailed to you as well.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone, for
Thank you.
being on.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.